Sonic, the heart of your system.
What is up, guys? This is Luke Hill for Kit Guru, and this is the Ryzen 5 3400G APU, so AMD's new Picasso APU. Let's take a look at the information. So codename Picasso, the Ryzen 5 3400G combines a 4-core, 8-thread Zen Plus CPU component with an 11 compute unit Vega GPU component. So priced at £140 in the UK and a $20 reduction in the MSRP over in the US. The biggest difference compared to last year's Ryzen 5 2400G is the use of Zen Plus on the CPU core, so a slight improvement in clock speeds and some of the architectural improvements over latency effectively on Zen Plus, and also we get a higher clocked Vega 11 GPU core, and this is thanks to the transition to 12nm manufacturing from global foundries. On the clock speed side of things, Ryzen 5 3400G sits at 3.7 GHz on the base clock and it boosts up to 4.2 GHz. As this is a Zen Plus CPU core, it uses 1 CCX for the compute component and it has 4 MB of L3 cache in total and 512 KB of L2 cache per core, so 2 MB of L2 cache total. So despite the Ryzen 3000 naming scheme, which is really confusing, and I'm not a fan of AMD doing this, they argue that it brings all of their products from one year into the same naming scheme, but I argue that it's kind of misleading because people see Ryzen 3000, they think 7nm TSMC, they think Zen 2. This is not Zen 2, it's not 7nm TSMC, this is lagging one generation behind, as we saw with last year's Raven Ridge APU. So this is Zen Plus, you don't get the gaming and the architectural improvements of Zen 2, and it's 12nm global foundry technology. Despite its 65W TDP rating, the Ryzen 5 3400G actually ships with the 95W rated Wraith Spire cooler. So this is a good thing because it should allow us to keep closer to those maximum boost clocks for a longer period of time with the overbuilt cooling, if you like. Also, AMD has switched from thermal paste, as we saw with last year's APU, to now they're using metal under the heat spreader. So that should also improve some of the thermal performance and allow us to hit those higher boost clocks for a more sustained period of time. AMD is clearly targeting 1080p gamers with the Ryzen 5 3400G. I mean, 1080p is the go-to resolution. It's by far the most popular resolution, has been for a long time, so it's a good target. So realistically, I don't think the Intel processors at this price point are realistically AMD's competition here. For the same £140, you could probably get a Coffee Lake 6-core i5, which is probably going to be, well, it's going to give you better CPU performance all around, despite having slightly fewer threads. The higher frequency will give you better overall performance for the CPU, but the iGPU and those Intel chips just cannot really handle gaming. It is nothing compared to the Vega GPU with 11 compute units that we see inside this Ryzen 5 3400G. So it kind of sits in a niche of its own. The real competitor will be a low-cost CPU plus a low-cost GPU, but that introduces some of the headaches on its own. So with light productivity and 1080p gaming being the focus for the Ryzen 5 3400G APU, let's move through to the testing. For our test system, we're using the Panasonic Prime Titanium 1000W power supplies to deliver us plenty of clean power. Our motherboard of choice is the ASRock B450 Steel Legend with the latest AGESA 1003 BIOS profile. We'd recommend B450 as a partner for the APU, as X570 is still a bit expensive and perhaps doesn't really justify its worth over B450 for this price range. The included Wraith Spire 95W rated CPU cooler will be used throughout our testing. Our RAM of choice is a pair of 3200MHz CL14 G-Skill modules, and these work fine at 3200MHz despite 2933MHz being the maximum officially supported speed by the APU. They worked fine on the B450 Steel Legend motherboard. We would recommend high-speed RAM because the GPU carves off, in our test scenario, 2GB of the system memory to use as its dedicated VRAM, so the higher speed is going to be of benefit there. So in our test, I'm going to highlight briefly the productivity performance of the Ryzen 5 3400G. We're not going to spend too much time on this, so if you want to look at the graphs and charts in more detail, then make sure you pause the video and also check the full review at the Kit Guru website. And then we're going to look at some of the gaming performance, and a lot of the information here and the information for this APU is very similar to the Raven Ridge Ryzen 5 2400G of last year, so make sure you go over and check Leo's review of that Ryzen 5 2400G last year, because a lot of the information holds true. Right off the bat, productivity performance in Cinebench looks pretty decent from the 4-core 8-thread chip. Ryzen 5 3400G isn't too far behind the higher clocked, more expensive Coffee Lake Core i5 in terms of multi-threaded performance. That's not bad for an APU to which demanding tasks such as multi-core rendering is only of secondary importance. Single-thread performance is an area where Intel continues to dominate. This Zen Plus APU does not feature the architectural improvements of Zen 2-based Ryzen 3000 CPUs, and therefore cannot match this single-threaded performance either. Unsurprisingly, the Ryzen 5 3400G is similar to the Zen Ryzen 7 1800X and Zen Plus Ryzen 5 2600X and Ryzen 7 2700X in single-thread performance. Blender chugs along nicely to a render time of just over 9 minutes in the BMW benchmark. That's not too shabby a result for an entry-level APU, and it's a fairly competitive score against the more expensive, but notably faster to be fair, Coffee Lake Core i5 6-core CPU. There's no reason why you can't use this APU to run the odd multi-core render here and there in Blender. Handbrake shows that the Ryzen 5 3400G APU does a decent job at handling our X264 conversion test. You don't get the AVX-based improvements of Zen 2 with this Zen Plus-based APU, but a conversion rate of close to 30 FPS for our media isn't too bad given the asking price. 7-zip performance is decent enough, especially given the higher importance of the decompression side of this test for this market segment. The odd heavy compression and decompression here and there certainly won't have you pulling your hair out with this level of performance being offered up from the CPU segment of this APU. So our gaming testing focuses on using the integrated Vega 11 GPU within this APU and seeing how we can get playable performance. We use some older AAA titles, the likes of Grand Theft Auto 5 and Ghost Recon Wildlands. We'll also include some less demanding, perhaps party mode if you like, games, so the likes of CSGO, Rocket League, Apex Legends. Running at the lowest settings level with MSAA off and the DX12 API, Deus Ex Mankind Divided is barely playable at 1080p with an average frame rate just shy of 30 FPS. Cranking the resolution down to 1600 by 900, which is a 30% reduction in display pixels, sees the average FPS number increase to 38, with a minimum just shy of 30. This is perhaps playable at a push, but isn't a great experience. Reducing the resolution again to 1280 by 720, a pixel count less than half that of 1080p, sees a perfectly playable 52 FPS on the average, with lows in the region of 40 FPS. This level of performance will be playable in a demanding title like Deus Ex Mankind Divided. Far Cry 5 on its lowest preset is playable at 1920 by 1080, but the experience won't be particularly smooth or enjoyable with an average barely above 30 FPS. Reduced down to 1600 by 900 and the frame rates climb to a more palatable low 40 FPS average with minimums in the high 30s. Still not ideal for PC gamers, but not bad for such an entry-level CPU plus GPU combination. 1280 by 720 allows an average frame rate just shy of 60 FPS. The minimums are also pushed past 50 FPS here in the benchmark, so the experience is certainly more than playable and would run nicely on a FreeSync monitor. With Ghost Recon Wildlands on its lowest settings, 1920 by 1080 is, as we have seen from other games, playable but not a particularly smooth experience. The mid-30s average frame rate and lows around the 20 mark aren't ideal, but they're solid enough performance for an integrated GPU. 1600 by 900 pushes the frame rate up to the mid-40s on average, with lows sitting around the mid-20s level. This is more playable and may be preferable to the higher frame rate but lower resolution of 720p. 1280 by 720 is where we see enjoyable frame rates with an average of 56 FPS and minimums of 38. Image quality isn't great at this level, but the gaming experience is perfectly adequate for such a low-cost offering. Shadow of the Tomb Raider in its DX12 mode is the newest AAA title in our testing. This game continues the same trend that we've seen previously, with average frame rates at 1080p being a playable but certainly less than ideal 39 FPS. Switching to 1600 by 900 pushed the frame rates up to 48 FPS on average, and this is territory where the gaming experience starts to become more enjoyable. 1280 by 720 delivered 61 FPS on average, and this was a decently smooth gaming experience, even if we did see drops down to around the 50 FPS mark. This is a good range for use with a FreeSync monitor. According to our benchmark numbers, GTA 5 ran happily at 1920 by 1080 with the lowest image quality settings. The average frame rate of just over 70 FPS was higher than we anticipated, so we took the opportunity to increase the image quality settings. Turning on FXAA, increasing population density, variety, and distance scaling to 50%, turning on tessellation to normal, and increasing AF to 2x were our initial increased settings. These resulted in an average frame rate of 65 FPS through the built-in benchmark on at 1080p. This was more than playable and enjoyable, so we pushed the IQ settings up again. This time, the previous settings were maintained and we increased texture quality to high, shader quality to high, and ambient occlusion to normal. This resulted in a suggested VRAM usage of 1950 megabytes from GTA 5's built-in estimator. Average frame rates were now 56 FPS, which again, we were perfectly happy with. So using these custom settings, we fired up GTA and had a quick run on the Ryzen 5 3400G, of course, to see how it played, nothing to do with just wanted to play GTA. So the gameplay experience was perfectly enjoyable and the image quality looked surprisingly decent even for such low settings. This really is a testament to the way Rockstar designed the game with hardware scalability in mind. Averaging around 40s to sometimes above 60s on the FPS numbers, depending on whether we were driving or walking or shooting. There's no reason why you can't enjoy this title at 1080p on the Ryzen 5 3400G. It's a pretty smooth, pretty solid gaming experience, which is good because GTA is a very, very popular title, even in 2019. I also fired up Apex Legends to see how the Ryzen 5 3400G would handle this quite popular free-to-play game. Resolution in this one was maintained at 1920 by 1080 and I adjusted the image quality settings mostly down to the lowest possible levels. The gameplay experience was perfectly reasonable. I struggled to hit 60 FPS, but I found running around 40 to high 50s to be pretty fine, given the caliber of hardware being used. Paired with a budget FreeSync monitor, I think this could be a reasonable cost-effective gaming solution, and if higher frame rates are preferable, there's always the option to reduce the resolution. If you simply want to play Apex Legends, the Ryzen 5 3400G can do that, and it does a pretty decent job. So Rocket League is perhaps one of the perfect candidates for APU gaming. Running at 1920 by 1080, we were able to push the settings up to their high quality presets and achieve strong frame rates. We observed around 60 FPS on average in our quick game, with drops down to the low 50s and highs of slightly above 70 FPS. There's actually a little room to turn up the AA if you feel the need for improved sharpening. Solid performance and certainly nothing we'd complain about in this title, so that's really good to see from a relatively entry-level, relatively budget APU option. Certainly more than we could expect from some of the competing CPU plus integrated GPU options. So CSGO is another popular game that should hopefully deliver pretty reasonable, pretty playable frame rates on this budget APU. We fired up the game and managed to average well over 60 FPS using 1920 by 1080 as the resolution and maximum image quality settings. Dips into the mid-50s were observed, as were highs close to 100 FPS. There's no reason why you can't use the Ryzen 5 3400G to fire up CSGO and enjoy a few rounds with your friends in this APU. We're not saying you're going to get highly competitive frame rates that will give you the edge over your competitors, but it's certainly a reasonable gaming experience if you just want to jump in the lobby with your friends and have a bit of a laugh. So overall, the Ryzen 5 3400G has delivered pretty decent, pretty solid, playable gaming experience from the Zen Plus based CPU and the Vega 11 GPU. We're quite impressed overall. If you want to play AAA titles, maybe you're going to have to reduce the resolution to 16 by 9 or 1280 by 720 with the low image quality settings. But really popular titles like GTA 5, like Apex Legends, like CSGO, like Rocket League, they all run pretty fine at 1920 by 1080, and you can even push the image quality settings in some of those games. So if you just want a budget option that works out of the box and runs some of the more popular games on the market, seems like a pretty decent option, the Ryzen 5 3400G does. So with regards to media consumption, video decode is handled by the Video Core Next or VCN engine built within the Vega GPU. So this engine can decode formats such as MPEG-2 at 4K 60, VP9 at 4K 60, H.264 at 4K 60, H.265 at 4K 60. So all the common formats are in there and they can be decoded by the hardware built into the GPU. It's worth highlighting that HDCP 2.2 is supported by the Ryzen 5 3400G, but be careful when choosing a motherboard to make sure the correct level of HDMI certification is built into the motherboard that you choose. So we did some testing with a few different common video formats to see just how well the APU can handle the GPU offload of media playback, so that we still got CPU compute there if we need it, and our experience was pretty reasonable overall. Our 4K 30 100 megabits per second H.264 content played without hiccups through VLC Media Player on Windows 10. The same can be said for the 1440p 60 50 megabits per second H.264 media, and also our 4K 60 80 megabits per second H.265 footage taken from a GoPro Hero 6. So using VLC Media Player on Windows 10, we managed to play a variety of different media contents and media formats perfectly fine, and they were all handled by the GPU. Whether it's the GPU engine or the Video Core Next engine, is kind of up for debate at the moment. It kind of jumps between the two, which is interesting because that might have some repercussions if you're trying to use the GPU and not the VCN engine at the same time. So we also tested YouTube playback, so obviously the VP9 codec through Google Chrome. 1080p 60 was just no problem. 1440p 60 was just no problem again. 4K 30 was perfectly fine, being offloaded to the GPU. 4K 60, we saw frame drops here and there, but that was mostly to do with me messing around with the monitoring software being overlaid on the screen. Playback was perfectly reasonable, to be honest, for 4K 60. So as an extreme stress test, just for the lulz, right, we loaded up some 8K content on YouTube, and this proved a bit of a step too far. So running some 8K 60 content, it just wasn't really capable on the iGPU. We saw a lot of stuttering, a lot of buffering, even though our connection speed through the internet was perfectly fine, 400 megabit download. We're still way off 8K 60 content being widespread, to be honest, so I wouldn't see this as a major downside at all. So power consumption for the Ryzen 5 3400G is at a level where most power supplies could handle this with just no problems whatsoever. Cinebench CPU only load, so it's hitting about 100 watts from the wall, which is just easy to deal with, to be perfectly honest. We must note the idle performance was really, really positive, so less than 40 watts on average, and this may be due to the combination of our B450 motherboard being quite aggressive in the voltage reduction under idle. The cores also sleep very heavily on this Zen Plus based APU, so that's a good power benefit from AMD, and this is really important because if you want to use it at always on HTPC or an always on NAS or a Plex media server, that low idle power usage is a really strong positive for the Ryzen 5 3400G. So when we were playing Shadow of the Tomb Raider, which obviously loads up the CPU plus the GPU, not all that much load on the CPU to be honest, but the GPU is pinned at 1400 megahertz maxed out. We saw, again, about 100 watts from the walls. When we loaded up both the CPU using Blender and the GPU using Unigine Valley, that's when we saw slightly higher in the 140 watt from the wall range. So again, not really all that difficult for a modern power supply and pretty reasonable for the 95 watt TDP, not power, but TDP rated Wraith Spire cooler. So temperatures from our Wraith Spire cooler were perfectly reasonable throughout testing. Using 100% fan speed, which is 3300 RPM, we saw the CPU peak in the mid-70s. It didn't really go much higher than that, even through sustained heavy CPU-only load. And the GPU stayed below the mid-50s, so this was running particularly cool, even when both the CPU and GPU were loaded. So no real need to upgrade from the Wraith Spire, unless you want the lower noise performance, because it does get a bit audible, it does get a bit irritating at 3300 RPM, but as far as raw cooling performance goes, the Wraith Spire is perfectly reasonable. So with respect to clock speeds, obviously running the Wraith Spire cooler, we saw just under 4 GHz on the sustained all-core frequency through Precision Boost. This was more or less, it was realistic, it's about 3950 or 3975 in Cinebench testing. For our one-core load, we didn't see this climb above about 4075 in Cinebench one-core testing. But analysing our data through a bunch of 3D Mark runs, we did see 4200 MHz being hit on occasion. So we saw the odd spike here or there up to 4200 MHz, but the single core or low core boost was certainly more reasonable and more happy in the 4050 to about 4075 MHz range. Throughout our game testing, the Vega 11 GPU was just completely pinned at 1400 MHz, so we didn't see any lower than 1400 MHz. So Precision Boost Overdrive and Auto OC is supported, and of course there's manual overclocking through the BIOS if you feel you need to push the CPU and GPU a bit further. Perhaps I'd recommend upgrading the cooler if you're going to be pushing a bit further, because the CPU was getting a bit, it was reasonable, but if you're going to be pushing the voltages, pushing the frequencies, it probably does get a bit toasty. Of course, you can also push the GPU. So AMD's intentions to make non-discrete GPU gaming a possibility with their APU, of course, came to light perfectly well with last year's Raven Ridge Ryzen 5 2400G. So thanks to the solid compute performance we got from the Zen-based core back then and the strong Vega GPU performance, we were perfectly happy playing at 1080p in some less demanding titles without a dedicated GPU, and that was great. And basically the Ryzen 5 3400G takes this and just delivers much of the same thanks to the improved clock speeds and the improved efficiency of the Zen Plus architecture, and also the 12 nanometer process shrink. It's important to make clear that this is not Zen 2. This is not 7 nanometer despite its Ryzen 3000 naming, so the performance is going to be closer to the Ryzen 5 2400G than it is to the Zen 2 CPUs. Obviously last year with the skyrocketed GPU prices due to the cryptocurrency boom, the APU was almost a I don't want to say no-brainer, but it was a really good option because low-end GPUs were just so overpriced and they were so hard to come by that the APU had a really strong niche for a particularly good price. This year, however, it's a bit more of a difficult equation because the low-end GPU pricing is a bit more reasonable. The second-hand market is, of course, absolutely flooded. So it's a bit more of a difficult purchasing decision, even at the reasonable £140 asking price for the Ryzen 5 3400G. So, of course, the alternative route to this £140 APU would be to go for a CPU plus GPU combination. In this range, you're probably going to be looking at one of the low-end, older Ryzen chips, because I couldn't honestly recommend a dual-core hyper-threaded Pentium at the rough price point you'd be expecting for the CPU. So £55, if you're lucky, on deal, gets you a Ryzen 3 1200, which is a 4-core, 4-thread Zen 1 chip. And then with the budget spare, you could probably just about get a GT 1030, which is hardly a performance-shattering graphics card, but that's where you can fit into the budget. To be perfectly honest though, Ryzen 3 1200 plus a GT 1030 is hardly a mouth-watering prospect. I mean, on average, yeah, the GT 1030 is probably going to be slightly quicker. It's not going to be a major difference, but the reduced performance of the Ryzen 3 1200 is going to be significant compared to the simultaneous multi-threading enabled and higher clocked CPU component of the Ryzen 5 3400G. So I personally wouldn't feel all that impressed by going for that option, especially because the APUs make a good stopgap solution until you can upgrade to a more affordable GPU, but keep your CPU component running. Therefore, the higher end CPU, the faster performance CPU, is going to be relevant there. So going down the second hand route, you probably will get better performance from the CPU plus GPU combination that you get off that big auction site. It's not an apples to apples comparison, but if it's your own money and you're happy to go second hand, then maybe look into that option. So first is the Ryzen 5 2400G, which now retails for about £120. I'd say the extra £20 for the Ryzen 5 3400G for new buyers is worth it. Obviously, there's no need to upgrade from last year's Raven Ridge chip to this Picasso one. But if you're buying new, I'd say the extra £20 for the higher clock speeds from the CPU, the slight improvements to the architecture through Zen Plus use on the CPU, the higher Vega GPU clock speeds, and also the better out-of-the-box cooler, that extra 20 quid is worth it in my opinion. So overall, the Ryzen 5 3400G is a strong APU. It offers pretty playable 1920 by 1080p gaming performance, even in some older AAA titles, although you probably want to crank the resolution down a bit in those older AAA titles, but Rocket League, CSGO, Apex Legends, GTA 5, they all run fine at 1920 by 1080, and that's impressive for a system without a discrete GPU. So if you've got space constraints, if you need that one PCI Express slot in your mini ITX system for something other than a GPU, this could be a really good option. If you're looking for a HTPC that does the odd bit of gaming here and there, and always on NAS or Plex media server, solid option. So I've been Luke Hill for Kit Guru. Thank you very much for watching. Give us a like and subscribe if you like this one. Make sure you go over to the Kit Guru website to check out our full written review, which has more detail. And if you want to help support us, then please do check out our merch store and also our Patreon. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.